Hey there, listeners. Welcome to this actually first normal podcast. Until now, I've been doing audio blogs and now and then a podcast with a guest or where I was a guest at somebody else's podcast. I decided to also do normal podcasts because I want to do more of them. And if I have to wait for myself to finish a blog every time before I create an audio blog, it will take a long time every time. And I want to publish more podcasts because my podcasts are doing quite a bit better than my social media posts. So I'm going after my audience. So welcome. Thank you very much for listening. And I want to apologize for one thing. I have been using a lot of these ragtime piano tunes in my audio blogs. And some of you have been pointing out to me that those are simply annoying. I apologize. I was trying to create something engaging because I thought maybe me just talking is going to be boring. So I clearly overdid it. I apologize. I won't be using annoying music anymore. I will just be giving you what you came for, and that is content. I will be talking about writing and about, in this particular episode, what constitutes good writing. So I will continue to do audio blogs as well, but those will be only maybe once a month or so because I have to wait until my blogs are finished before I can make them. So every week I'll try to just do a normal podcast in which I talk to you about certain subjects. And you're going to hear me make mistakes in speaking, and you're going to hear me use a lot of ums and that sort of stuff. But this way I can give you some true value every single week, and that is great, right? So forgive me if this sounds a little bit improvised. Well, that's because it is a little bit improvised. But what I'm going to give you is good information that is useful for you as a writer and will help you to reach your full potential as a Christian nonfiction writer or as a nonfiction writer in general. So, I have a cup of coffee. I see that my Cubase is running. My AKG C414 is pointed at my mouth, so I am ready to go. So, what constitutes good writing? Good writing is a matter of courtesy. You know, what is the difference between writing something for yourself as a little note or a journal or anything that is not meant for others and writing that you do for others? Well, it is a matter of courtesy. You're trying to give the reader something in such a way that it truly adds value to their lives. So when you write to yourself, it is about you. When you write to share it with somebody, it is no longer about you, it is about your reader. And how does everything come across to your reader? And is your reader gonna go through the transformation that you intend? So will it impact their lives positively? Because that is actually where you want to go. And to achieve that, readers must be immersed in your story or immersed in your ideas. You need to know how to take your reader onto a journey that they can really experience everything along with you. And most of the time, that is a matter of taking away, of removing all obstacles. If you want to tell your story, what is the biggest enemy? Well, that is that the reader gets distracted by the way you are writing, the way you are using your words or your phrases or your sentences, the way you are organizing your information or not organizing your information. Everything that can distract readers from that experience, from that flow of story, from that flow of logic. That is an obstacle to comprehension and an obstacle to engagement. So, I often say it like this. Good writing is removing all obstacles. And it is, of course, a bit more. Because once all the obstacles are removed, you can still have, well, let's say then you have good writing. If your obstacles are all removed. But then you can turn that good writing into great writing by adding specific literary elements that enhance what you have. But you have to start by removing all the obstacles. And the obstacles are the main issues I find as an editor. Because the first thing you want to do is make sure that what you write is comprehensible. And That comprehension actually brings engagement, because then the reader can lose him or herself in your story. But then to really make it great, you can add this extra layer of the extra fireworks to it. So what are the main obstacles that we first need to remove before we can add any fireworks? Well, one of the main problems I see as an editor is long-windedness. That authors are not getting to the point on time. They are writing, they're writing about all kinds of things. So their story or their exposition goes this way and that, and there is no clear point where the author is going to. Or the author just simply wants to include too many examples that tires the readers out. Pacing is extremely important when you're writing, because if something is going too slow and too many asides and too many things are mentioned that are not really important for your narrative or for your exposition, the reader simply gets bored, they fall asleep. So you need to keep their attention by also all the time giving new information that is relevant, that builds upon the information that is already given. So long-windedness is giving too much information that is not immediately apparently relevant to your reader. So when I coach writers, one of the things I teach them is to exclude everything that is not 100% relevant to their story. So first of all, you need to find that focus. And actually that brings me to a second thing I often see, the lack of focus. That's another obstacle. I teach writers to find this focus, this one message that they want to bring across, and then to exclude everything that does not have anything to do with that main message, with that focus of the story. This can be a theme statement, a very short statement about what the story is about, or a thesis statement, a short summarization of the argument that you try to defend with your book. Or simply a slant, just a summarizing sentence. But that is the focus of your book, the focus of your nonfiction work. That is where it's headed, and everything that does not support this main idea, the big book idea, you exclude. And if you exclude everything effectively, you also solve the long-windedness. Because it can also, to write very wordy, that can also make it long-winded. Using way too many words to say things that you could also express in very few words. So that has to do with the tightness. And maybe let's take that as number 3 of the common obstacles to comprehension. That is wordiness. We should always try to go for the simplest words and try to avoid these long phrases, that, especially prepositional phrases, that can also be expressed in a very short word. I'm not saying that we should never use jargon or never use concept nouns or whatever, because I am of the opinion that sometimes those words are extremely useful, actually necessary, because every concept noun or every word of jargon has a world of meaning to the initiated. So this is then a matter of who your audience is, of course. If your audience understands these more complicated words, then use them, because actually that helps you quicken the pace again. It is a difficult word maybe, and it might make it incomprehensible to many of your readers, of many readers in general. But your reader will understand that word, and therefore you can, instead of explain a certain concept over a number of paragraphs, summarize that one in one word. And in a split second, your reader will have understood a world of thought. So actually using difficult words can also solve long-windedness. But okay, in general, you still want to avoid wordiness. So avoid using more words than necessary, and avoid using more multi-syllable words that take more effort to process. This has to do with processing fluency in the brain. So that when you read a word, your brain does not need to burn too many calories to understand what it means. But of course, as I said, if you have to explain a principle that can also be summarized in one difficult word, then your reader will end up burning even more calories. Okay, so what else can be an obstacle to your reader comprehension and your reader engagement? Continuity issues. I've seen a lot of continuity issues in manuscripts that landed on my desk. I've published a podcast about that before. Continuity issues arise when you do not structure your material in a logical way, that one idea is building upon the other. So continuity issues can arise when you don't have a clear idea track. There's another podcast of mine about idea tracks. So one idea logically flows into the next idea, logically flows into the next idea, so that your reader is never confused about where you are or how you got to a certain point. If the reader is wondering that at some point, then there is something wrong with your continuity. But also in narrative, you find continuity issues. It usually has to do with using some past in a present storyline where it is actually obstructing the flow of the storyline. Let me give you a little example. I'm sitting here behind my desk, and suppose that a fellow editor comes pounding into the room, slams his hand on my desk and begins yelling at me, and I get upset with him for all the accusations that he is making toward me, and I race through the door, which is still open because the other editor had left it open, and I race onto the hallway and outside to blow out some steam. So, by the time I got to the door, I mentioned that it was still open because the other editor that came pounding into my room had left it open. But it also gave a hiccup in my storyline. It would have been much better to write that this fellow editor came pounding into my room, leaving the door open behind him, and he slammed his hand on my desk. So that once I got pissed enough to race out the room, I didn't have to mention anymore that the door was already open. So I could just say, I raced out the room into the hallway and outside to blow out my steam. You see that by putting together what belongs together chronologically, I created a smoother storyline. Because every time you have to explain something that happened in the past in the middle of an action line, you break apart the action to insert some explanation, a piece of the past. And that just really destroys the flow. And it can be very subtle. I mean, this was quite a subtle example. By putting together what belongs together, the whole story begins to flow better. And in this particular case, it actually added to the image that the reader had. Because now you also see this fellow editor storming into my room, and he is so upset that he doesn't bother to close the door. He doesn't care that other people in other offices can hear what he is screaming at me, right? So this image of this door standing wide open adds to the drama of this little scene. And because this opened door is already registered in the reader's brain, they see in their mind's eye the door opened behind this fellow editor. So as soon as I begin to race outside, no explanation is necessary anymore. They just see me running out of an open door. So there we fixed a continuity issue. So those very subtle continuity issues are very common. And basically the solution is to always put together what belongs together. In a chronology, just see what happens at that particular moment and describe it so that you don't have to remind the reader of anything later. In the case of exposition, always wonder, where did I leave the reader? What does the reader need to know next to be able to follow my reasoning? Am I skipping parts of my argument? Of course, for any kind of writing, it's always good to have somebody else read your work, but it's not always possible. So try to be aware of these dangers yourself. And the better you do this already, the less you'll have to pay an editor to fix these things afterwards. Because my experience is that few issues are as time-consuming to solve as continuity issues. Okay, another obstacle to engagement To comprehension, not so much, but an obstacle to engagement is to always only tell and never make an effort to show things. Well, actually, this is already a bit, what I spoke about earlier, that embellishment that you can use to turn good writing into great writing. Still, if you really never show anything and always use dull language, which is not visible at all, then your reader will also get just too bored to even give your writing a chance. So always try to find something visible. My recommendation is to, at least every page, add something that the reader can see, even if it is only an analogy or a little anecdote or something visible, because we experience stories, or actually, no, let's put that differently. We experience life, and everything that we discovered on our own, we experienced basically through story. Everything, it is a story of our life, which is visible. We can smell it, we can taste it, we can hear it, we can see it. Some sensory input on every page, not only visible, but I meant visible as that is the most important one, what you can see, but it is also about hearing and smelling and everything, all of the senses. You want to have something on every page to engage some of the senses, because that is how we experience life. When we want to discover something, we go to a certain place to look, to hear, to smell, to touch, to experience. And if the reader, while reading your book, sometimes has this experience of being somewhere to learn something, that really helps engagement. That shakes them awake. That helps the reader to keep paying attention. And paying attention is one of the most important things. Attention is what is often lacking when a book does not use enough of these literary devices. You want to hold readers' attentions, and only when the reader has real attention for what you are sharing will they learn anything from it. So if you are, especially if you want to write something redemptive, it is important that your reader thoroughly understands what you're talking about on an emotional level, but also an intellectual level. So try to engage the senses so that you'll keep your reader's attention, and your reader will really learn something, will be really focused on the message that you want to convey. Another obstacle to reader comprehension and engagement is repetitiveness. I so often see it that within paragraphs, but also across paragraphs, that the same information is presented twice or 3 times or 4 times. Within paragraphs is often the most annoying thing, that one sentence in a paragraph makes a certain statement, and then there's a statement or a sentence that supports the statement, and then actually the statement is made again in the next sentence, and probably in other words. But the point is the reader understands the message. So in that regard, it is really a good idea to use these old constructions of a topic sentence and then some supportive sentences and then a closing sentence, so that you keep the main information, the main point you're trying to make, this paragraph, at the beginning, and then you support it. But I can imagine that you want to write a little bit more intuitively. Well, if you do, then make sure that your sentences, that every sentence holds a unique message, a unique thought. One sentence is one complete thought. And every single sentence needs to have a thought that adds to the point that you're trying to make with that particular paragraph. It should not be repeating it. At best, it should be another example illustrating the same thing, if that would be necessary for reader comprehension. An extra example is not useful if that does not aid comprehension or engagement. So it is actually usually better to only give one example. If one example will do, then that's enough. Because your reader gets annoyed when they have the feeling you're feeding them the same stuff over and over and over again. By the way, I'm sorry if I'm doing that with these podcasts, because this is not really scripted or very loosely scripted. So forgive me if I repeat myself a few times here. Okay, Now, I want to take a moment now to invite you to join my email list, because every week I'm sending out emails with very useful writing tips, because you're already interested in my stuff. That's clear. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to me right now. So I'm very happy that you are still listening to me. If you want to hear more of my stuff, join my email list. And I'm also working together with a number of other editors in the Christian writing and editing industry to create a magazine full of tips and advice and inspiration and whatever. There's also a free writing course. So go to my website, www.yourbeststory.net, yourbeststory.net, and you will find a form to join my email list. Looking forward to hearing from you. Another obvious obstacle to reader comprehension is confusing sentence structure. And this is very common. That sentences are structured in such a way that the reader is left to guess what it means exactly. Most of the time, just the standard structure of subject, verb, and then the rest. That is usually the easiest structure, easiest to comprehend. And then avoid using too many of these relative clauses and that sort of stuff that makes your reader wonder where stuff is going, or that taxes the reader's working memory, because they have to remember the first part of the sentence, and then you have a relative clause, and they have to still, in the meantime, remember the first part of the sentence, and then when the sentence continues, they still have to make sense out of the main sentence that has been broken up. So it's best to be careful with those constructions and really make sure that if you use them, that everything works well, that there is congruency between all the subjects and verbs and pronouns, etc., that everything is working well. And one thing that really helps is, for example, if you have a relative clause, one of those that start with that does something or who does something, like Niels, who is recording a podcast right now, is talking into his favorite microphone, for example. The who clause there, that is a relative clause. And sometimes you really need to cut that clause out and read the sentence, those clauses out, and read the sentence that is left, because it has to make sense still. It has to make sense still together. So make sure that all the sentence structures that you use, that they are correct, and also that you don't spread them too far apart and make them too complicated. That being said, I also don't think we should oversimplify everything all the time. Because, at the end of the 19th century, people were just capable of reading complicated sentences all the time. But we've lost that ability a bit by always making everything very simple. So I actually appreciate it when writers are sometimes using sentences that remind us of how these structures work, so that we won't unlearn that entirely. I always think, well, if in the 19th century people were capable of reading long sentences, complicated sentences, then we nowadays should also be capable of doing so. And I think it would be a mistake to exclude complicated sentences from our writing entirely, because it is good, I think, to challenge the reader a little bit, so that collectively we remain capable of understanding sentences like that. Also, I think you can really add some riches to sentences like that. It breaks the structure a little bit. If you're using short sentences all the time, tuck it, it becomes such a machine gun. But if you switch that now and then with a longer sentence that is maybe a little bit more complicated, maybe asks a little bit more from the reader, well, that is fine. I would just say don't lead with it. Don't use complicated sentences at all in the lead, because you want to hook people at the beginning. You want to hook them. You want to make sure that you are as engaging as possible at the beginning of your article. So make sure that when you lead your article, you use simple language that's easy to process. Relatively short sentences, that are also easy to process. Because if the reader at the beginning of your article or your book thinks, oh, this is going to be difficult, then they are going to quit. But once they are hooked, I think you can and maybe should also use somewhat more complex structures. And once the reader is hooked, they are also willing to work a little bit harder. But don't go overboard with that either. I think it is very important for our language and for writing in general to not turn everything into the very most simple thing that we can make it, because we will start sounding alike and so on. It's also not necessary. But if you use a complicated structure, make sure that it works, that it is correct, and that it is not confusing. I think another obstacle can be that you're not personal enough. I think many people who know a lot about a certain subject have the tendency to approach that subject as if it is something that is outside of themselves. But I think it is boring for most people to read about a subject when there is no personal lilt to it. So I think you should really be certain that you have something personal to say about it, some personal experience, some personal opinion or illustrations that really bring it close to yourself, that the reader is reading about you just as much as about your subject. Especially nowadays when AI can crank out all kinds of stories and articles and whatever. And AI gets better and better at that. Actually, this whole idea that AI cannot be creative or cannot be intuitive, I think it is nonsense. It has proven that it can be intuitive and it can be creative. So it becomes more and more important that when you write something, that you write from your own personality and that you integrate yourself, your own character, your own experiences into what you write, because that is the only thing, in my point of view, that is going to distinguish your work from that of just any AI, especially in the future, because AIs are going to get better and better. So this boils down really to what you want to achieve with your writing. If you just want to bring knowledge across, just want to teach somebody like a textbook, for example, then maybe you should reconsider. Do you want to be a writer? Because that kind of writing is going to be replaced by AI. But if you want to engage your reader with something personal, then there's no way that an AI can do that. It will always be fake. It can never be able to have the experiences that you have during the course of your life. So not being personal enough is not only an obstacle to your reader's engagement, but it is also, on the long run, going to be useless because it is something that computers can do as well. So as you see, most of these things actually do not have to do with correctness. Except for the confusing sentence structure, there is an element of correctness in there. But the thing is, correctness, as in correct grammar, correct spelling and that sort of stuff, is important because if people see spelling errors and whatever, they might get annoyed by that. But it is by far not the most important thing. The most important things have to do with the ideation, with what you want to say, what you want to put in, what your focus is, how you narrow that focus down, whom you're talking to, etc. And only at the very last station, you worry about correctness. And that is, of course, an obstacle to your reader's comprehension and engagement. But it is much worse, I think, to have a story that doesn't quite work or that doesn't quite engage than that it is to have an error here and there. Actually, it has been proven that people are more forgiving towards errors than they are towards stories that just don't really make so much sense. So the storytelling is way, way, way more important than the correctness in the tiny details. So remember that when you start your writing project, make sure that in the ideation stage and while you grow this project, that you always think, what is the best way to tell this story? How do I make this more engaging? How do I pinpoint the audience that I want to speak to so that I will be using their language and I can make it comprehensible for them and engaging, especially for them? And how do I avoid continuity issues? And how can I make this personal? And how can I engage the senses of the readers so that they will keep paying attention? How can I avoid being repetitive? All those kinds of things. Consider those while you are planning and working through your drafts. Because only at the very last stage you should be worrying about spelling and grammar. Okay, and that concludes this podcast about what constitutes good writing. If you have any advice on how I can improve these podcasts or subjects that you would like me to talk about or whatever, please reach out to me. And again, go to yourbeststory.net to join my email list and receive the best advice that I can give you every week in your email box. God bless you and have a great week. Bye-bye.